The key turned in the lock with a sound both foreign and familiar, like an echo from a place I had always carried in my chest. The cottage door creaked open, and the scent rushed out at us pine cedar, and the faint musk of age that clung to old wood. Malcolm stepped in first, careful with his footing, as though he were entering a chapel. I followed my hand, grazing the frame, the grain beneath my fingertips, rough in places, smooth in others, worn by decades of use. We stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle over us. The Adirondack air seemed to breathe through the open windows, lifting the curtains in gentle waves. Outside, a loon called across the water, its cry stretched and mournful, dissolving into the trees that lined the far shore. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the sound soak into me like rain into dry soil. "This is it," Malcolm murmured, setting down the small box of books he insisted on carrying himself. He straightened his silver hair, catching the late sun, and gave me the kind of smile that held 40 years of waiting. "This is it," I repeated more to myself than to him. We wandered from room to room, each step unveiling some new imperfection that somehow made the place more beautiful. Floors that groaned like an old friend, windows with rippled glass that softened the view of the lake into a painting, a kitchen that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, layered over ancient varnish. It wasn't pristine, it was lived in. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint but steady hum of belonging. In the back room, I found a dresser pushed against the wall, its drawers empty, except for one that resisted when I tugged. I leaned my weight into it, wood protesting, and finally, it slid open with a reluctant sigh. Inside lay a single folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, the ink browned but legible. I hesitated before picking it up, as though disturbing it might break some unseen seal. The handwriting was sharp and deliberate, each letter carved with a steady hand. "This home cannot bear those who trample its peace. Protect it, or you will lose it." The words seemed to linger in the air after I read them, as if the house itself had spoken. I felt Malcolm behind me before I saw him, his presence quiet but steady. "What is it?" he asked, setting a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Just a note," I said too quickly. I folded it and slipped it into my pocket, the paper crisp against my palm, something the last owner left behind. He nodded without pressing further. That was Malcolm's gift. He never demanded explanations before I was ready to give them. He turned back toward the living room, humming the same tune he'd carried since we left town that morning. I stood there alone, the words burning faintly in my mind. The warning unsettled me, but it didn't feel ominous. It felt intimate, like advice passed down in secret. Perhaps the former owner had written it in bitterness after some family quarrel. Or perhaps they had known something about the weight of silence, the way it could be both shelter and danger. I couldn't decide if it was a blessing or a burden. Outside, the lake shifted as the wind moved across it, catching the surface in silver ripples. I pressed the drawer closed again and ran my fingers along the top of the dresser. This home, I thought, would not be taken lightly. Not by me. By the time I joined Malcolm in the living room, he had already pulled 2 chairs close to the window. He gestured for me to sit, then passed me a mug from the thermos we'd brought. Coffee, still warm, carried the earthy smell of roasted beans into the room. We sat together without speaking, watching the sky deepen into amber. The cottage creaked softly around us, as though settling into our presence, or testing whether we were worthy. I touched the pocket of my sweater, where the letter rested, its weight no more than a feather, yet heavier than any box we had carried. The lake gleamed through the glass, endless and steady. For the first time in decades, I believed we had found a place that might finally belong to us. And yet, even in that stillness, I could feel the letter waiting to be reckoned with, whispering its demand for protection as shadows lengthened across the floor. The next morning, The light was slow to rise, spilling across the lake in soft streaks of gold. I carried my mug to the porch, the boards cool under my bare feet, and settled into one of the old wicker chairs that had been left behind. Malcolm followed a moment later, setting his coffee down on the railing before easing himself into the seat beside me. For a while, we said nothing. The world outside was already speaking loons across the water branches, rustling the occasional slap of a fish breaking the surface. Silence had never felt so full. I breathed it in, letting it press against the walls of my chest until something tight inside me began to loosen. "This feels different," I said at last. Malcolm gave a small nod, the steam from his cup drifting up like smoke. "Because it's ours." The word settled between us with more weight than I expected. Ours. How long had it been since I'd said that about anything? The house we raised our son in had always felt like his first, ours second. The holidays, the meals, even the stories, it all bent toward him and later toward the family he built with Celeste. I used to believe that was natural, the way generations turned like pages in a book. But over time, the edges of that belief frayed. I remembered Christmases where I sat quietly in the corner, hands folded in my lap, while Celeste announced menu schedules and seating arrangements. If I suggested bringing my old pecan pie, she would smile and say, "The kids don't really like nuts." When I offered to babysit, she insisted they already had someone the children knew. My gifts were set aside unopened or politely thanked and never mentioned again. Little things, but they added up, forming a wall I could never climb. Malcolm had noticed, of course. He always did. Sometimes his hand would find mine under the table, a quiet reassurance that I wasn't invisible, at least not to him. But he never said anything out loud. Neither did I. I told myself I didn't want to cause trouble for Rowan. Yet silence, once meant to keep peace, had become its own prison. Now, sitting on the porch, with the sun warming my face and the lake breathing calm into the day, I realized how much of myself I had given away in those silences. Piece by piece, I had become smaller, as if I were nothing more than a guest in other people's lives. Here, though, this house, this porch, this view, it was mine again, ours again. Malcolm reached across the space between us, his fingers brushing mine. "Feels like we've finally stepped into the part we kept promising each other," he said. I smiled at that. For years, every time money was tight or circumstances unkind, we'd end our late-night conversations with the same two words one day. We whispered them like a prayer, a reminder that the future held something gentler than the present. And now that day had arrived. Still, the folded paper in my pocket weighed against me. I hadn't shown it to Malcolm, not yet. The warning from the former owner felt personal, like it had been written to whoever needed it most. Protect this peace, or lose it. I didn't know why, but it felt like the house itself was whispering through those words, and I wasn't ready to speak them aloud. The breeze shifted, lifting the curtains behind us through the open door. I thought of all the places I had sat, holding my tongue, biting back my words, convincing myself that patience was love. Here on this porch, I wanted something different. I wanted my voice to belong. Malcolm lifted his cup, studying the horizon. "It's quiet now," he said, "but it won't always be." His words weren't a warning, not exactly. Just truth. The world had a way of pressing in. I looked back at the lake, the steady shimmer of water catching the light, and told myself I would be ready when it did. The phone rang inside the house, its shrill echo breaking the stillness as cleanly as a stone thrown into water. The ring startled me, not just because of its sound, sharp and urgent against the quiet, but because I hadn't heard it in so long. The landline sat on the kitchen counter, beige and square, its cord coiled in a tangle, like it had been waiting all these years just to announce this moment. I set down my cup and walked inside, the boards beneath my feet, creaking as though they too resented the interruption. Malcolm looked up from his chair on the porch, his brow furrowed, but he didn't move. He let me answer. "Hello," I said, pressing the receiver to my ear. "Isolde. Hi?" Celeste's voice burst through bright, cheerful, and edged with the kind of confidence that came from never expecting resistance. "We'll be there tomorrow morning at 9 with 25 of us. Everyone's excited. Hope you've got the rooms ready. We'll stay 2 weeks. The kids can't wait to swim." Her words landed like stones, one after another, sinking into the still water of my chest. I gripped the phone tighter, waiting for the part where she'd laugh, where she'd reveal it as a joke. But Celeste never joked. "Celeste," I began slowly. "We've just arrived ourselves. We haven't even finished unpacking. This is perfect," she cut in her tone. Light, dismissive. "So you're settled then? You don't need all that space for just you and Malcolm. Family helps family, right? My parents are flying in and Travis is bringing his dog. The more the merrier. It'll be a relief after the month we've had. We'll bring snacks or something." She said it as if she were granting me a favor, as if my life were a stage where her plans could play out. I stood frozen at the window, the lake beyond still gleaming in the sun, but I no longer felt its calm. The words from the folded letter pressed against my memory: "Protect it, or you will lose it." Behind me, I heard Malcolm rise. He stepped into the doorway, drying his hands on a dish towel, his eyes steady on mine. He didn't speak, didn't ask. He only placed his palm on my shoulder, grounding me. I turned slightly toward him, the receiver hot against my ear. "This isn't a rental," I said quietly into the line. "This is our home." Celeste laughed light and airy, like she'd heard a child announce a rule she didn't intend to follow. "Exactly, so it's settled. We'll see you at 9. And before I could form another word, the line went dead. The kitchen filled with a heavy silence, thicker than before, as if the air itself had swallowed her entitlement and held it there, demanding I confront it. I set the phone back in its cradle, my hand lingering on the plastic. Malcolm moved to the counter, pulled a mug from the box still waiting to be unpacked, and filled it with cold water from the tap. He handed it to me wordlessly. When I met his gaze, I saw not surprise, not even anger, but a calm recognition, as though he'd been expecting this storm all along. "You've got something turning in your mind," he said finally. I swallowed the cool water, feeling it steady the heat that had risen in my throat. "I do," I answered, my voice low, almost foreign to me. He nodded once, then leaned against the doorway, folding his arms. That was all he needed to give me space and trust. I walked back to the porch, the mug still in my hand, and lowered myself into the chair. The lake glimmered unchanged, as if mocking the chaos that was about to descend upon it. My silence stretched not out of fear, but out of something sharper, a clarity I hadn't allowed myself in years. Tomorrow at 9, she would arrive. But tonight, I still had a choice to make. After I set the receiver down, I stayed in the chair by the window, staring out at the lake but not seeing it. My mind had already wandered backward, unspooling years of moments I had tried to bury. Celeste's voice, bright-clipped, unyielding, had the power to summon them all. I remembered the first Thanksgiving at their house. I had arrived with my sweet potato casserole, the one that used to disappear at church potlucks, the one my neighbors asked for by name. I carried it in, carefully wrapped in a towel to keep it warm. Celeste glanced at it, her lips pulling into a polite but flat smile. "Oh, we don't really do heavy sides anymore. The kids are eating cleaner." She turned away before I could set it down. I ended up carrying it back to the car, the dish still steaming in my hands, feeling like I had smuggled in something shameful. Another winter, I had knitted her a scarf, soft blue wool, chosen to match the coat she wore so often. I folded it neatly, tucked it into a box, and wrapped it with care. At her birthday gathering, she opened it in front of others, nodded quickly, and set it on the counter without comment. It lay there the entire evening, forgotten under paper plates and empty glasses. I told myself it didn't matter that not every gift needed to be treasured. But something in me dimmed that night. Then there were the offers I made, hoping to be useful, to be included. I'd be glad to watch the children, I'd say. Malcolm and I can take them for a weekend, give you both some rest. But Celeste always had a reason to decline. They already have a sitter they know. They're on a routine. We don't want to burden you. She never saw that her refusals didn't protect me from burden. They erased me from belonging. Each memory stacked itself on the last, thin and weightless alone, but together, becoming heavy as stone. A ledger written not with ink, but with silences, dismissals, and polite smiles that left bruises no one else could see. And always, beside her, Rowan, my son. My boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, who once clung to my hand in crowds. Now, a man of 45, silent in his wife's shadow. He never contradicted her, never defended me, never reached across the gulf she widened. Sometimes he offered a weak smile, as if to say, I know, but let's keep the peace. Other times he said nothing at all, and that silence cut deeper than any words. The ledger lived inside me, hidden, until today. Celeste's phone call had thrown open the pages, reminding me that every slight, every dismissal had brought me to this edge. The cottage, the lake, the air thick with pine. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, the one place not touched by her voice. And now she wanted to drag her army of relatives through the door as if it were nothing more than a vacation lodge. Malcolm came to stand behind me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. He didn't speak, and he didn't need to. He knew the tally as well as I did. He had been there for every small wound, watching them layer into something harder, sharper. I reached up and touched his hand, letting the weight of my decision begin to form. Tomorrow, at 9, she would come with her demands. Tonight, we would decide how to answer. The sun had slipped lower by the time I finally stood from the window. The glow across the lake had turned amber shadows, long and restless. Malcolm followed me into the dining room, where the table sat half-assembled bolts, still loose, one leg wobbling slightly each time we leaned against it. We lowered ourselves onto the chairs anyway. It was solid enough to hold us for what needed to be done. Malcolm pulled a pad of lined paper from the box of books he had unpacked earlier. He flattened it on the table, found a pen, and slid it into his hand with a quiet decisiveness that steadied me. We need a plan, he said simply. I nodded. My own hand smoothed the paper, though he was the one writing. He drew neat lines across the page, the kind of order only he could bring. At the top, he wrote, rental agreement. Seeing the words there made my chest tighten, but in a way that felt purposeful. He wrote in dates, check-in and check-out times, rules for occupancy, and a line for signatures. He didn't dress it up with flourishes. It looked official enough to halt momentum, and that was all we needed. I reached for my phone, scrolled through a list of local inns we had passed on the drive up, and chose one on the far side of the ridge. The woman on the line spoke warmly. We have a room with a fireplace available for tomorrow. I booked it without hesitation, relief prickling along my skin like pins and needles. When I ended the call, Malcolm had already written our names neatly at the bottom of the page. We sat in silence, the paper between us. The cottage creaked in the settling evening, the sounds of an old house adjusting to its new occupants. It felt as if the walls were listening. This way, Malcolm said, tapping the agreement with the back of the pen, we don't have to argue. We just hand it over. I traced the rim of my mug, cold now from neglect. No raised voices, I murmured. No explanations they wouldn't hear anyway. Exactly. For a long moment, I just breathed, letting the plan take root. I thought of all the times Celeste's voice had rolled over mine, crisp and certain, while Rowan stayed quiet beside her. Words had never been enough with her. They were brushed aside like crumbs. But this was action. Quiet, unshakable action. My hand slipped to the pocket of my sweater, where the folded letter still rested. This home cannot bear those who trample its peace. Protect it, or you will lose it. The warning had sounded strange when I first read it, like a ghost muttering through the wood. Now, it felt like truth. I pulled the paper out, laid it gently on the table. Malcolm leaned closer, reading the careful strokes of a stranger's hand. He didn't comment, but his eyes met mine, and in them I saw agreement. We weren't just defending four walls. We were defending something we had waited decades to claim. The cottage groaned softly, the windows catching the last scraps of light. Outside, the water shifted the surface, breaking into silver fragments as a breeze moved through. I felt the tension in my chest ease. Tomorrow was already coming inevitable, but tonight belonged to us. Malcolm set the pen down, folded the agreement with deliberate care, and slid it into the center of the table. "We're ready," he said, and for the first time in years, I believed him. The night crept around us cool and insistent, and still we stayed at that table, the silence between us no longer heavy but strong. We didn't need more words. The decision had been made, and it would carry us through the morning. When we finally rose, I left the old letter on the table beside the folded contract, two pieces of paper that together held more weight than any argument I could ever give. The contract sat on the dining table like a sentinel. I woke before dawn, the room still cloaked in gray, and saw it there folded, once edges sharp. Malcolm was already up, moving quietly through the kitchen, setting water to boil. The familiar hiss of the kettle and the creak of floorboards steadied me in ways I hadn't expected. We didn't talk much that morning. The decision had already been made, and words seemed unnecessary, even dangerous. Instead, we rehearsed in silence. Malcolm unfolded the paper, slid it across the table, then placed it back again. I watched him nodding and pictured Celeste's face when she read it. "No explaining," I said finally, my voice low. "No explaining," he echoed. "If she demands answers, we hand her the paper." He held my gaze, and then we walk out the door. That door. I turned to look at it, the brass knob glinting faintly in the half-light. By it leaned our packed suitcases, zipped and ready. Two neat bags, nothing more, but the sight of them gave me strength. They said we were not trapped. We had already chosen freedom. Malcolm poured the coffee, the dark stream filling the mugs with a rich scent that drifted through the room. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine, then sat across the table. Steam curled upward, catching the light of the early sun, just beginning to press through the curtains. My heart beat fast, too fast, as if it hadn't yet learned that fear was no longer required. I wrapped both hands around the mug and tried to anchor myself in its warmth. Beneath the racing pulse, there was something steadier, clearer, a flame that had taken years to kindle, now burning quietly. I thought of all the mornings I had sat at Celeste's table, cup in hand, listening to her set the rules for the day: who would cook, who would watch the children, what time we were expected to arrive at the park or leave for church. I had nodded, then biting my tongue, pretending it was easier that way. But this morning was different. This table was mine. This coffee poured for me not as an afterthought, but as a promise. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. "She'll push," he said. "She always does. And Rowan." He let the question hang. I swallowed. My son's silence weighed heavier than Celeste's sharpness ever could. He had stood by her side all these years, watching as she dismissed me, and never once lifted his voice. I loved him, but love no longer meant surrender. "If he follows her lead," I said, steadying myself on the words, "then he'll read the paper too." Malcolm nodded, satisfied. We didn't need to say more. The plan was simple. No shouting, no pleading, just one sheet of paper and two bags by the door. The cottage groaned softly, settling into the day. Outside, the water caught the first light, shimmering in faint gold. I sipped my coffee and felt the steam warm my face. Beneath the tension, clarity held. We had nothing to prove, nothing to defend. Only peace to protect. Malcolm folded the agreement again, slid it into the center of the table, and rested his hand on top of it. "This is enough," he said. I believed him. We finished our coffee in silence, the kind that wrapped around us like armor. Then I rose, carried my empty mug to the sink, and glanced once more at the bags waiting by the door. They looked back at me like old friends, patient and sure. By the time I returned to the table, the sun had risen higher, spilling gold across the floorboards. The light touched the folded contract, sharp and certain, as though marking the spot where everything would change. As the morning stretched, I found myself caught in the snare of old memories. The contract sat on the table like a shield, but my mind kept dragging me backward to the moments that had forged the need for it. 10 years earlier, Thanksgiving had been moved to Celeste's house. I had offered to host, but she insisted it would be simpler for everyone to gather at theirs. I still remember the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filling my car as I drove my sweet potato casserole on the seat beside me, wrapped in towels to keep it warm. It was my signature dish, the one everyone asked for at potlucks, the one I'd made every November since Rowan was a boy. I carried it through her front door with care. Celeste was in the kitchen, crisp apron tied around her waist, directing traffic with the confidence of someone who believed she was the only one holding the day together. She glanced at the dish, gave a thin smile, and said, "Oh, we don't really do heavy sides anymore. The kids are eating cleaner." She turned back to her chopping board before I had even set the casserole down. "No, thank you. No, just a small portion." Nothing. My son, beer in hand, shrugged apologetically when our eyes met, but said nothing. I carried the casserole back to my car and left it there, the dish hot in my hands like a secret shame. Inside, laughter carried on without pause, no one asking where my food had gone. That was the beginning. There was the birthday a few years later. I had bought thoughtful gifts for each grandchild puzzles books, little jackets I thought would keep them warm. I wrapped them carefully, tied them with ribbon, picturing the children's faces when they tore through the paper. Celeste took the bags from my arms at the door. "Thanks, I'll sort these later," she said briskly. "They already have too much stuff." I never saw the children open them. I never knew if they did. My gifts had vanished into a back room like contraband dismissed before they had the chance to matter. Rowan stood nearby, adjusting his tie, and avoided my eyes. Other moments bled together. Invitations where I was told to bring napkins instead of food. Family outings where my suggestions were brushed aside with a cheerful, "We've already tried that." Even small interactions, her voice raised slightly over mine at the dinner table, the way she would cut in finishing my sentences as though she were tidying up a mess. All of it cloaked in efficiency and the tone of someone who insisted she was simply keeping things moving. But efficiency was her armor. It gave her control over the room, over the story, over me. She wasn't shouting, wasn't cruel outright. She was tidy, capable, decisive. And in her decisiveness, there was no room left for me. I had told myself for years that it wasn't malice, that she was young, busy managing more than I had ever managed at her age, that she simply didn't see how her words landed. It was easier to excuse it, to keep the peace, to sit in silence for Rowan's sake. But each time I swallowed my hurt, it hardened into something else. Sitting in the cottage now with the paper folded neatly on the table, I understood the sum of it. Every casserole rejected, every gift dismissed, every offer declined had been leading here. Celeste didn't want help. She wanted control, and I had allowed it, believing patience was the same as love. I reached for my coffee, now gone cold, and set it aside. The cottage creaked as though shifting its weight, reminding me that this place was different. This time, I would not walk back to my car with what I carried. The air thickened with quiet. Malcolm came in from the porch, his expression steady. and glanced toward the contract. The look we shared said enough. Tomorrow was no longer something to fear. It was something to answer. That night, the cottage held its breath with me. Malcolm had fallen asleep quickly, his steady breathing rising and falling beside me. But my body refused to rest. I lay flat on my back eyes, tracing the shadows that the moon and branches cast across the ceiling. They swayed slowly, like silent ghosts with nowhere else to go. The loon's cry carried across the water, long and mournful, the sound winding through the walls and into my bones. It had been haunting earlier, almost beautiful, but now it felt like a warning. Each call stretched out into the night air, reminding me of what waited just beyond the hours, cars pulling up voices, spilling out footsteps, filling the porch that should have been mine. I turned on my side, tucking the blanket closer around my shoulders. But the unease didn't lift. My mind replayed the phone call, Celeste's voice bright with entitlement. "We'll be there at 9, 25 of us. 2 weeks. It wasn't just the words, it was her tone. She spoke as though it had already been decided, as though I were a caretaker instead of the owner of this house. The folded letter sat on the nightstand within reach. I picked it up, smoothed its worn paper, and read the words again by the dim glow of the lamp. "This home cannot bear those who trample its peace. Protect it, or you will lose it. Protect it." The phrase repeated itself in my head until it was no longer handwriting on a page, but a voice speaking into the marrow of me. It did not feel like advice anymore. It felt like commandment. Fear prickled at me in waves. What if Celeste laughed at the contract? What if Rowan stood at her side silent again? What if 25 voices demanded what was mine, drowning out the quiet I had waited decades to earn? For a moment, I felt the old instinct tugging at me to yield, to swallow, to convince myself it was easier not to make trouble. But something steadier pressed back against that fear. I thought of the casserole left in the car, the unopened gifts, the scarf abandoned on the counter. I thought of all the times I had been erased under the name of efficiency. Each memory rose like a stone, building a wall around me, not to trap me, but to protect me. I turned onto my back again, the letter still in my hand, and stared at the ceiling. The shadows above seemed to bend closer, listening. "I will protect it," I whispered into the dark. My voice surprised me, quiet, but certain, like a vow spoken in a church. Malcolm stirred, then shifting against the mattress, but he didn't wake. His hand brushed mine in his sleep, steady and warm. That small contact steadied me more than any thought. I slipped the letter back onto the nightstand and let my palm rest lightly on his. Sleep didn't come easily, not fully. Instead, I drifted in and out, caught between the rhythm of Malcolm's breathing and the restless hum of my own heart. Each time my eyes closed, I saw headlights rolling down the gravel road, doors opening, voices spilling out. Each time they opened again, I saw the folded contract on the dining table, waiting like a shield. Outside, the branches tapped against the glass, as though reminding me the hours were moving. Tomorrow would come whether I was ready or not. But lying there in the dark with the loon calling and the letter whispering, I began to believe that readiness had less to do with sleep and more to do with resolve. The night thinned slowly, its edges paling toward dawn, and I rose before the first light touched the water. The fog came first. It lay across the lake like a veil, silver and unbroken, swallowing the far shore so completely it felt as though the world had narrowed to our cottage and the still water below. I stood at the kitchen window, with a mug warming my hands, watching the mist shift in slow swirls. It reminded me of breath on a mirror, fragile, temporary, and yet powerful enough to obscure what lay behind it. The contract rested on the dining table, folded with precision. Even from across the room, it seemed to hum with quiet authority. Our bags leaned neatly against the doorframe zippers closed, ready for the moment we stepped out. I had packed and repacked them in the restless hours of the night, not because I doubted what to bring, but because the act itself steadied me. Malcolm joined me, his footsteps soft on the worn boards. He carried his own mug, the dark scent of coffee filling the air between us. For a while, he said nothing, just stood beside me, shoulder-brushing mine, both of us, staring into the fog as though we might glimpse the future in its shifting shapes. Finally, his voice broke the quiet. "They'll be here soon." The words landed gently, but firm, like a bell tolling the hour. I nodded, unable to answer at first. My heart was already pounding, the sound filling my ears, but beneath it ran a steadier current. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was clarity. "I know," I said, my voice rough from disuse. He set his mug down on the table and touched the folded paper with the tips of his fingers almost reverently. "This is enough," he said, echoing what he had told me yesterday. I turned from the window, let my gaze settle on the contract. One sheet of paper. That was all. No speeches, no raised voices, no accusations. Just boundaries written plainly, impossible to argue, without revealing the arrogance behind the demand. I walked to the table, sat down, and unfolded the page. My eyes scanned the words again. Dates, rules, signatures. It looked official, because it was official not from any court, but from us. Our authority, our ownership. My fingers trembled slightly as I refolded it, but I felt no urge to hide it away. It belonged in the open ready. Malcolm slid the paper closer to me, then leaned back in his chair. His calm steadied me as it always had not, because he took the weight from me, but because he reminded me I didn't carry it alone. I used to think I began slowly, that peace meant swallowing things, letting them go, pretending they didn't matter, so the family would keep moving forward. His eyes met mine, patient. But it wasn't peace, I continued. It was silence. And silence didn't protect anything. It only eroded me bit by bit. Malcolm reached for my hand across the table, his palm warm against mine. "Not this time," he said. I squeezed his hand, let the truth of it anchor me. Outside, the fog pressed closer against the glass, wrapping the house in its soft cocoon. For a moment, it felt like the mist was shielding us, holding the world at bay until we were ready. I rose, carried my mug to the sink, and rinsed it clean. My reflection in the window above the basin looked older than I remembered, but steadier too. The lines around my eyes were not weakness. They were proof I had endured. Proof that I had earned the right to protect what was mine. By the time I returned to the table, Malcolm had stood stretching his shoulders as if preparing for labor. He glanced at the bags by the door, then at me. "Shall we wait on the porch?" I nodded. The fog was beginning to thin in places, threads of light weaving through. The day had begun, and with it, the reckoning. The first sound was gravel crushed under tires. Then came the hum of engines, one after another, until it was a chorus climbing the hill toward the cottage. I stood at the window and watched as the fog unraveled with each approach, the silver curtain torn by the bright beams of headlights. The cars rolled in bumpers nearly touching, like a parade rehearsed for weeks. Malcolm was beside me, steady as stone, his jaw tight but calm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. We had already said everything worth saying. Doors slammed in succession, sharp cracks that broke the morning's fragile stillness. Voices tumbled out, children shouting, adults calling, the rumble of laughter spilling like water from an overfilled pitcher. The air, once hushed, now felt trampled. Through the screen door, I saw Celeste first. She emerged from the lead car with sunglasses perched on her head, hair tied in a perfect knot, clipboard clutched in one hand. She didn't glance at the lake, didn't pause to admire the trees, didn't acknowledge that this was not her home. She strode up the steps as though she were returning to a place she owned. The porch creaked under her heels as she swept through the doorway without knocking. "All right, everyone," she called, her voice brisk, already in motion. "Kids' shoes off by the door. Mom and Dad, you'll take the main bedroom. Travis and Emily, you're near the bathroom for the baby. Everyone else spread out upstairs. We'll make it work." She was already halfway across the living room when she glanced at me. "Oh, Isolde, there you are," she said brightly. Like I were a piece of furniture she expected to be in place. "Do you have extra folding beds? The kids don't like sleeping on the floor." I sat at the dining table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The contract lay just within reach. Folded, waiting. My silence thickened. Not the silence of defeat, but of patience. Malcolm stood behind me, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. Celeste moved briskly, pointing at corners of the room as though arranging pieces on a board. "We'll need to move that chair. It'll make more space for the luggage. And—" She stopped, finally noticing the suitcases by the door. Her brows knit for the briefest moment, but then smoothed over. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" she asked, half laughing as though the idea itself were absurd. I said nothing. My fingers traced the seam of the folded paper, feeling its edges sharp against my skin. She took a step closer, tilting her head. Isolde Malcolm's voice answered calm and even. "We've made other arrangements." Her eyes flicked between us, confusion flickering, then irritation. She pressed the clipboard against her hip, tapping the pen in her hand. "Other arrangements. What does that mean?" Still, I stayed silent. My heart pounded, but beneath it was steel. Silence was my weapon now. Celeste's smile faltered. "Well, we'll talk later. For now, let's get everyone settled." She turned toward the door, barking instructions again. But her voice carried a thin edge now, a thread of uncertainty weaving into her certainty. I watched the children tumble in, laughing, carrying bags too big for them, their voices echoing against the beams. They didn't see me. None of them did. Only Celeste, standing in the center, trying to spin the chaos into order, waiting for me to yield to step aside. But I didn't move. My hands stayed folded, the contract ready. Malcolm's hand brushed my shoulder as he passed behind me, the faintest touch enough to steady me. The moment was coming. She didn't know it yet, but everything she assumed was about to shift. The laughter outside grew louder as more doors opened. More footsteps approached, and the house braced for the invasion. The noise in the house swelled with each passing second, bags dropping on the floor, shoes, scuffing voices tumbling over one another, as if the walls themselves had been pulled into service. Celeste stood in the middle of it all, clipboard raised like a conductor's baton, determined to shape the chaos into order. I stayed seated at the table, hands folded in my lap, the contract resting within reach. My eyes followed Malcolm as he stepped forward, calm and unhurried, his presence steady against the storm. "Celeste," he said, his voice carrying just enough to cut through the chatter. She turned, distracted pen, poised as though she might jot down another assignment. "Yes, we need to move the luggage upstairs." The bedrooms. Malcolm held out the folded paper. "This is for you." Her smile stiffened as she took it, brows lifting in surprise. She glanced at the top line, her voice catching. "Rental agreement." I rose slowly from my chair, my pulse quick, but my voice even. "You didn't ask." The words landed heavier than I expected. For a moment, the room stilled, the laughter and footsteps outside fading against the weight of silence. Celeste blinked, her mouth parting confusion, clouding her expression before anger sharpened its edges. "What is this supposed to mean?" she demanded, flipping the paper open. Her eyes darted over the lines Malcolm had written, the dates, the signatures, the rules. "You're renting out your own home?" Malcolm stood tall, his arms loose at his sides, but his tone stayed steady. "We're handing over the keys at 10 o'clock. We've made other arrangements." Her gaze shot to me, searching for a crack in my resolve. But I told you we were coming. We made plans. I kept my voice level, refusing to rise to her urgency. You told us. You didn't ask. She faltered the clipboard, lowering at her side. Around us, footsteps paused in the doorway, voices dipping uncertain as family members peered in, sensing a shift they didn't understand. Celeste's authority, usually smooth and unquestioned, seemed suddenly brittle. You can't just walk out, she said. Finally, her tone tightening. But there was a hint of disbelief beneath it, as if the idea itself had never occurred to her. We can, I replied. And we are. Malcolm moved to the door, lifting one suitcase, then the other. His movements deliberate, unhurried. I joined him, sliding my hand over the brass knob. Celeste remained rooted in the center of the room, paper. Still in her hand, her control slipping between her fingers. You'll regret this, she said, her voice low now, almost strained. I met her eyes one last time, not with anger, not with apology, but with clarity. No, I won't. The air outside was crisp as we stepped onto the porch, the fog lifting to reveal the lake glimmering in pale light. The noise behind us dimmed as the door closed, replaced by the steady rhythm of our footsteps across the boards. Malcolm placed the bags in the car, the soft thud of the trunk closing, punctuating the moment. I slid into the passenger seat, my chest rising and falling with a rhythm that was not relief, not yet, but something close. As the engine turned and the cottage receded behind us, I felt no urge to look back. The road bent away from the cottage, curving through trees that seemed to lean close, as if to bear witness. Neither Malcolm nor I spoke. The hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires filled the silence that sat heavy between us. But it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was something steadier, shaped by resolve. My hands rested in my lap, fingers curled loosely, and though my pulse still raced, I knew it was no longer fear. The ridge climbed steadily, the cottage slipping out of sight behind us. I could almost feel Celeste's eyes on our backs, still clutching that piece of paper, her control unraveling. For years I had carried her voice inside me, sharp and efficient, cutting into every space I entered. Now for the first time, I had left it behind, sealed in those walls where it could no longer reach me. Malcolm's hand tightened briefly on the steering wheel, then eased. We did what we had to do, he said quietly. I turned my face toward the window, watching sunlight begin to pierce the thinning fog. I know, I murmured. It just feels strange. To walk away instead of swallowing it. Strange, he agreed, but right. The road wound higher until the lake vanished completely and the air sharpened with pine. When the inn came into view, a 2-story building tucked between tall cedars, smoke curling gently from its chimney, it looked almost like it had been waiting for us. Malcolm pulled into the gravel lot, parked, and cut the engine. The sudden quiet pressed close around us. Inside the inn smelled of cedar and firewood, a comfort that wrapped itself around me the moment we stepped through the door. The woman at the desk greeted us with a smile that held no judgment, only welcome. We've got your room ready, she said, handing over a key attached to a wooden fob. It's upstairs with a fireplace. The room was simple, 2 chairs by the hearth, thick quilts folded at the foot of the bed, beams dark with age. Malcolm set the bags down with a sigh, his shoulders easing for the first time all day. I moved to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched the flames catch their crackle, filling the room with a music that soothed more than words ever could. For a while, we sat together in front of the fire, the warmth seeping into our bones. I thought of the house across the ridge, already crowded with voices and footsteps, and felt a pang that was not regret, but something harder to name. It was the ache of distance, of choosing silence when habit had trained me to yield. Then the phone began. At first, a single buzz on the nightstand. I ignored it. Then another, and another. Soon the vibration pulsed in intervals, a drumbeat of demands trying to pierce the quiet we had chosen. Celeste's name lit the screen again and again, followed by Rowan's then unknown numbers I suspected belonged to her relatives. Malcolm glanced at the phone, then at me. "Do you want to?" "No," I said firmly. The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and stared into the flames. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't move. Each ignored call built a wall higher, stronger, until the noise became nothing more than background, powerless. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the shifting fire and the occasional creak of the old beams. The phone continued its relentless hum, but the silence we held was louder, more deliberate. When the fire sank to glowing embers, Malcolm rose, pulled the quilt from the bed, and draped it over my shoulders. His touch lingered at my neck, gentle, before he settled back into his chair. We said nothing more that night. The silence was enough. By morning, the calls had shifted to messages. The phone lit up on the nightstand in bursts, each glow followed by the chime of a new demand, a new attempt to break through. I sat in the chair by the window quilt around my shoulders, the mug of tea warming my hands, and watched the light change across the trees outside, as though it were the only rhythm I meant to follow. The first message came from Celeste, brisk and cheerful, the way she always sounded, when she thought tone could disguise command. "Evelyn, everyone's confused. The kids don't understand why you left. Please call me back so we can sort this out." I didn't answer. Another arrived minutes later. "We drove a long way. My parents are tired. The children were looking forward to swimming in the lake. It's not fair to them." Not fair. The words made my jaw tighten. For years, fairness had never been the point. It had always been convenience, and I had always been the one to yield. Not this time. A third message followed, tinged with hurt. "If you needed space, you should have told us. We would have understood. Now everyone feels unwelcome." I let the phone go dark again. Space was not what I had taken. I had reclaimed what was mine. Malcolm moved quietly about the room, folding clothes into drawers we might not even use. He said nothing about the phone, only brought me another cup of tea when mine grew cold. His silence was not absence. It was agreement. As the messages kept coming, another memory surfaced unbidden. A cookout years ago, when the family had gathered in our backyard. I had carried out a platter of fruit for the children, sliced neatly, arranged with care. They had crowded around me, eager for the sweet pieces, laughing as juice dripped down their chins. For a moment, I had felt like myself again, part of the circle. Then Celeste's voice rang out, pitched just high enough for others to hear. "Isolde's great with the kids as long as you tell her exactly what to do." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was the polite chuckle people give when they don't want to choose sides. But it cut me clean through. I had smiled, pretended not to mind, but my fingers had tightened around the platter until I feared it would crack. Rowan had been there, sitting in a lawn chair, sipping his drink. He didn't say a word. That moment had stayed with me, echoing louder, each time Celeste brushed aside my efforts, each time Rowan's silence reinforced her power. Now, with the phone buzzing endlessly, I understood that every word she sent carried the same dismissal. I would only matter if I complied. I lifted my tea to my lips, the steam soft against my face, and drank slowly. Each swallow steadied me. Each ignored message was a refusal to be pulled back into the same old pattern. By afternoon, the phone's glow no longer unsettled me. It lit, it dimmed, it lit again, but my hand never moved toward it. The sound became nothing more than background, like distant birdsong, easy to ignore once I decided it held no claim on me. Malcolm joined me at the window as the sky shifted toward dusk. He set his hand lightly on the back of my chair, looking out at the forest trail beyond. Neither of us mentioned the phone. We didn't need to. Its echoes belonged to another world, one I had stepped out of the moment we left the cottage. When the last light drained from the sky, I rose, set the empty mug on the nightstand beside the buzzing device, and turned down the quilt on the bed. The messages could wait forever. I had already given my answer. By the third day at the inn, the messages had slowed. The flood of Celeste's demands had dwindled into a trickle of half-hearted justifications, and then eventually, silence. I thought perhaps she had given up, or perhaps she had shifted to saving face with her gathered relatives. Either way, the quiet was its own kind of relief. But late that afternoon, as the light stretched long across the cedar floorboards, the phone rang again. Not a text, not a faceless buzz of words, but a call. The screen lit with a name I hadn't expected. Rowan. For a long moment I only stared at it, the sound filling the room like a heartbeat. Malcolm looked up from his book, watching me without comment. He knew this was mine to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear. Hello? There was a pause, then his voice lower than I remembered, hesitant. Mom. It's me. I closed my eyes, leaning back in the chair. I know. I didn't know about the trip, he said quickly, words tumbling over themselves. Celeste made all the plans. She told me the night before, same as you. I should have checked in, but I didn't. That's on me. I let the silence hold for a beat before answering. She said you were coming. 25 of you, as if it were already decided. He sighed, the sound heavy, almost ashamed. I know. I'm sorry. The apology sat between us, fragile. Part of me wanted to seize it, hold it like proof that he still saw me. Another part knew how easily words could evaporate. I've watched her do this for years, he continued, voice quieter now. Take control, decide things without asking. And I just let it happen. I thought keeping the peace was better than making a scene. But I can see now what that did to you. I should have said something. My throat tightened. I pressed my fingers against the quilt in my lap, grounding myself. You were there, I said softly. Every time. And you said nothing. The line was quiet, except for his breathing. I know, he whispered. I can't take that back. But I don't want to keep being silent. The words cracked something in me. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the faintest shift in the wall I had built around my heart. This was not Celeste's polished confidence. This was my son's unvarnished voice, uncertain and raw. I don't know what you expect me to say, I told him. I don't expect anything, he answered. I just needed you to know I'm sorry. And I miss you. The ache those words stirred was sharp, pulling me back to the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, the teenager who sat at the kitchen table asking about colleges, the man who had slowly disappeared into someone else's shadow. But I didn't let the ache decide for me. Not yet. I hear you, I said. Nothing more. Another pause. Then softly, that's enough for now. The line clicked, leaving me in the stillness of the room. The phone lay heavy in my hand, his voice still echoing in my ears. Malcolm closed his book and met my eyes. He didn't ask what Rowan had said. He only nodded, as though he already knew. Outside, the evening light bled into the trees, soft and uncertain, like a promise that might or might not hold. 2 weeks later, we drove back over the ridge. The inn had served us well, its quiet hallways, the cedar beams, the fireplace, that held our silence without question. But it was not ours. Each night, I lay awake, a little thinking of the cottage across the water, wondering whether its stillness had survived without us. The gravel road curved familiar under the Tyers trees, leaning into one another, as though they had been guarding the way in our absence. When the cottage came into view, my chest tightened, not with dread, but with something closer to reverence. We parked and stepped out. The air smelled the same pine and damp earth, the faint sweetness that had clung to the porch from the very first day. Malcolm carried the bags, and I followed him up the steps, my hand brushing the rail. The wood was cool beneath my palm, but steady. Inside, the air greeted us with a rush of memory. The faint scent of cinnamon still lingered from the muffins I had baked before everything began mingling with the musk of old beams and polished wood. It was as though the house had held its breath waiting for us. No voices, no laughter spilling in where it did not belong. Just quiet. I set my bag down in the corner and stood still, letting the silence wrap around me. My lungs filled deep, the kind of breath that reached the places worry usually kept tight. For the first time in weeks, maybe in years, I felt the hum of belonging, without question. Malcolm dropped his bags by the bedroom door and came to stand beside me. "Untouched," he said softly. I nodded. The chairs sat exactly where we had left them, the mugs still stacked neatly on the counter, the contract lying folded in the drawer. Everything in its place as if the invasion had been nothing but a dream. I crossed to the kitchen window and looked out at the lake. The water caught the sunlight rippling in slow waves that glittered like glass. It didn't look changed, and yet I felt it differently. It was no longer a fragile piece I feared losing. It was something I had claimed defended, even if only through silence and departure. I thought again of the letter still folded neatly on the nightstand upstairs. Protect it, or you will lose it. I had carried those words with me like a stone in my pocket. Standing here now, in the still air of my own home, I knew I had obeyed them. Malcolm's hand brushed mine, grounding me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The cottage had given its answer. It remembered us, and it remembered the respect we demanded for it. I breathed again, slower this time, and felt the weight in my chest ease. This was home. Not borrowed, not trampled, not conditional, ours. And with that truth steady in my bones, I turned back to Malcolm. Tomorrow, I would write to Rowan. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, spilling across the table where the folded contract still rested in the drawer below. I sat with pen and paper before me, the weight of unspoken words pressing heavier than any suitcase. Malcolm busied himself outside stacking kindling by the porch. He left me to the task he knew I could no longer delay. I thought of Rowan's voice from the call at the inn, uncertain, apologetic, stripped of Celeste's polish. It had cracked something open in me, but cracks were not enough. If there was to be any path forward, I needed to build it with my own terms. I wrote slowly, each word deliberate. You are always welcome here, but not with demands, not with assumptions. Respect first. I love you, but I will not disappear to keep peace. I read it twice, then folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. My hands shook as I sealed it, not from fear, but from release. For decades, I had waited for permission to speak plainly. Now I realized no one could give it to me but myself. Later that afternoon, I typed the same message into my phone and sent it to Rowan. The quiet afterward was immense. Minutes passed, then the screen lit with his reply. I understand. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. I'll do better. The words were simple, but they held something his silences never had recognition. For the first time in years, I felt the weight shift from my chest, as though the cottage itself exhaled with me. I set the phone down and walked to the window. The lake shimmered in the afternoon light, patient and endless. Behind me, Malcolm came in, dusting his hands, his eyes searching mine. "Well," he asked gently. I gave a small smile. He heard me. Malcolm nodded nothing more, but I saw the relief in his shoulders. We stood together in the kitchen, the scent of wood smoke drifting in through the open door, and I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not triumph, but balance. For the first time, the terms were mine, and as dusk drew its veil across the lake, I knew the story wasn't ending here. Night draped itself over the lake with a gentleness that felt earned. The water mirrored the stars, each point of light trembling as though it had a pulse of its own. Malcolm and I sat on the porch, wrapped in quiet, the kind that carried no weight, no edge, only rest. He handed me a mug of tea, the steam rising to soften the cool air. I stopped by the inn in town. "Today," he said after a while, his voice low, "ran into the keeper." I turned curious. "She mentioned something," he continued. "Apparently, Celeste tried to rent the cottage through a local agency. Thought she could book it for the family, bypass us entirely. But they told her the owners had set firm restrictions. No third-party rentals, no exceptions. For a moment, I just held the mug in my hands, the warmth seeping into my palms. Celeste still reaching, still trying to bend the world to her will. And yet this time, the walls had held. Our boundaries had not crumbled when pressed. They had stood without us having to speak a word. I felt no rush of triumph, no satisfaction at her failure. What I felt was steadier, quieter dignity. The house had not been taken. The peace we claimed had remained ours. Malcolm shifted the boards beneath him, creaking softly. "It seems she's not used to hearing no," he said. "Neither is Rowan," I replied gently. Then I looked up at the stars, so many of them scattered across the black expanse, and breathed deep. But maybe now he's starting to listen. The letter's words came back to me. "Protect it, or you will lose it." I had thought at first it was about the cottage. Perhaps it was. But tonight, watching the shimmer of the lake, I understood it differently. It was about myself. About the quiet dignity I had nearly given away through years of swallowing words. Protection had not been cruelty. It had been survival. I sipped my tea, the taste earthy and calm. The night air wrapped around us filled with the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Malcolm leaned back, his profile lit by the porch light, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. Age had not made me weak. It had made me deliberate. Every silence I kept now was chosen, not imposed. Every boundary I set was a declaration that I had not disappeared, that I still mattered. As the stars burned steady above the lake, I felt seen, not by Celeste, not even by Rowan, but by myself. And that I realized was enough. When respect finally knocks, do you savor it alone or open the gate to the world outline, setting northern U.S. Adirondacks region? A woman main character. Isolde Harrington, 68, and her husband Malcolm, 70, unlock their new lake cottage. They savor the cedar scent, old wood floors, distant call of loons. It feels like a lifetime's reward. While exploring, Isolde finds an old letter in a drawer left by the former owner. "This home cannot bear those who trample its peace. Protect it, or you will lose it." The letter unsettles her but also intrigues her. She slips it into her pocket. Hook Q. If you found a warning hidden in your dream home, would you laugh it off or take it to heart? Isolde reflects on decades of being overlooked in her son's family. Silences dismissals. She imagines this house as her sanctuary, free of obligations. Malcolm, steady and calm, shares coffee on the porch. They talk about this being the first place that's theirs. Hook Q. What would you guard more fiercely, your peace or your family's approval? Landline rings. It's her daughter-in-law, Celeste Kavanaugh, 42, a sharp, commanding woman. Celeste announces she'll arrive with 25 relatives at 9 a.m., staying for 2 weeks. No asking, only telling. Isolde is stunned, reminded of years of being sidelined. Malcolm silently steadies her, sensing. This is the turning point. Hook Q. When someone assumes authority over your home, do you bend or break their expectation? Isolde remembers moments her sweet potato casserole rejected her hand-knit scarf, ignored her offers to babysit, brushed aside. Each memory is a layer of dust that hardened into resentment. She recalls her son, Rowan, now 45, silent, beside Celeste, never once speaking up. Hook Q. How many small wounds does it take before you finally say enough? At the half-assembled dining table, Isolde and Malcolm draft their plan. Malcolm sketches a rental agreement. Isolde books a nearby inn. They decide no confrontation, just action. The old letter lingers in her mind, reinforcing her resolve. Hook Q. Would you confront with words, or let silence deliver the lesson? They rehearse calmly. If Celeste demands, hand her the contract. They place their packed bags by the door. In the kitchen, steam curls from coffee mugs. Isolde's heart pounds, but beneath it, clarity. Hook Q. If your peace depended on a single sheet of paper, would you trust it? Flashback 10 years ago. Celeste dismissed Isolde's casserole. Later, birthday gifts for grandkids swept aside. Each memory reveals Celeste's tactic control masked as efficiency. The flashbacks deepen the reader's sense of injustice. Hook Q. When does helpful become hostile, and why do we excuse it for so long? Night before the invasion. Isolde can't sleep, listening to loons and shifting branches. She thinks of the old letter, again protected. Fear mixes with determination. Hook Q. If tomorrow promised chaos, would you flee or stand and let it crash against your walls? Dawn fog wraps the lake silver light. Isolde stands with coffee contract on the table, bags packed. Malcolm says softly, "They'll be here soon." Hook Q. Would you see fog as concealment or as protection? Cars crunch on gravel doors, slam laughter echoes. Celeste strides in, clipboard in hand, immediately assigning rooms. Isolde stays silent, hands folded. Hook Q. When someone claims what is yours is silence, strength or surrender. Malcolm hands Celeste the rental agreement. Isolde says evenly, "You didn't ask." Celeste falters, confused, angry. Isolde and Malcolm pick up bags, walk out. Hook Q. If you walked away from confrontation, would you feel cowardly or free? They drive to the inn over the ridge, silence in the car thick but dignified. At the inn fireplace, cedar beams, stillness. Phone buzzes constantly ignored. Hook Q. Is silence a shield or another form of battle? Messages flood in. Celeste claims confusion, guilt tripping about kids. Isolde doesn't respond. Flashback a cookout where Celeste mocked her as good with kids if told what to do. Isolde sips tea, choosing not to reply. Hook Q. is not answering cruelty or clarity. For the first time, Rowan the son calls alone. He admits he didn't know about the trip, apologizes. Isolde listens but doesn't commit. This is a new crack in the wall of silence. Hook Q. When someone finally speaks for themselves, do you believe them or wait to see change? 2 weeks later, Isolde and Malcolm return. Cottage still smells of wood and cinnamon untouched. She breathes deeply. It feels like home again. Hook Q. Can a place remember whether it was respected, or is that only in our minds? Isolde writes to Rowan. You're welcome here, but not with demands. Respect first. He replies, I understand. I'll do better. She feels the weight lift. Hook Q. When you finally set terms, do you risk love or protect it? Epilogue. Night at the lake. Stars shimmer. Malcolm hands her tea. Twist, a local innkeeper, tells them Celeste tried to rent the cottage through a third party, but failed. Boundaries held? Isolde reflects, not triumph, but dignity. Closing reflection. Age is not weakness. It is choice. Final hook Q. When respect finally knocks, do you savor it alone or open the gate to the world?